When a young man aged out of the system with nothing, he inherited a derelict farmhouse his grandfather left him. But what he discovered in the cellar wasn't just a secret. It was a choice that would define the rest of his life. If you've ever felt lost and wondered if there was a second chance waiting for you somewhere, hit that subscribe button and stick with me. This story is for you. The last day felt exactly like the first, and all the days in between. It tasted like disinfectant and lukewarm coffee. It sounded like the tired hum of fluorescent lights and the distant rhythmic squeak of a custodian's cart making its way down the hall. For 2 years, my world had been contained within the beige, scuff-marked walls of the Northwood Transitional Living Facility. It wasn't a home, it was a holding pattern. A place where you turned 18 and were given a grace period to not become a statistic. I had just used up my last day of grace. My caseworker, Miss Albright, handed me a manila envelope that was surprisingly heavy. It felt like it contained a brick, not a future. "This is it, Leo," she said, her voice attempting a warmth that the institutional gray of her office always seemed to swallow. "Everything the state has for you, and everything he left." He was my grandfather, a man I only remembered in flashes of scent, pipe tobacco and damp earth, and the rough, calloused feel of his hand. He'd been a ghost for most of my life, and now, apparently, he was a landlord. Inside the envelope was my final check from the state, a paltry sum meant to be a launch pad, but felt more like a push off a cliff. Beneath that was a thick sheaf of papers held together with a binder clip, a deed, a property tax statement deeply in the red, and a single, ornate iron key. The key was cold and heavy, a piece of a forgotten century. It didn't look like it belonged to anything in the modern world. Ms. Albright cleared her throat, pulling my attention from the strange object. "The property is in a place called Stillwater Creek. It's rural, very rural. According to the county records, it hasn't been inhabited for almost 15 years. She slid a printed-out bus schedule across the desk. "There's a bus that leaves at 4 p.m. It'll get you to a crossroads about 2 miles from the property. From there, you walk." The finality of it was breathtaking. From there, you walk. It was the story of my life. I'd walked away from foster homes, walked out of schools, walked through city streets with nowhere to go. This was just one more walk. But this time, I was walking towards something, or so I hoped. The bus ride was 6 hours of watching the world I knew dissolve. The dense, vertical maze of the city gave way to sprawling suburbs, which in turn bled into flat, anonymous highways bordered by franchise restaurants and gas stations. Then, slowly, the landscape began to breathe. The concrete softened into wide green shoulders of grass. The buildings shrank, pulling away from the road, until they were replaced by fields of corn, their stalks whispering secrets to the wind. The few passengers on the bus with me were a collection of weary travelers, each lost in their own world of headphones and window gazing. I felt an invisible wall between us. They were going somewhere familiar, to family, to jobs, to lives they had built. I was traveling to a ghost. I clutched the envelope in my lap, the sharp corner of the deed pressing into my thigh. Homeless after leaving college wasn't exactly my story, because I never had the luxury of college. My story was simpler. Homeless after leaving the only system I'd ever known. The farmhouse wasn't a choice. It was the only door that hadn't been slammed in my face. The bus driver, a man with a kind, tired face, called out, "Crossroads at Route 7 and Old Mill Road." It was my stop. I was the only one who got off. The bus pulled away with a hydraulic sigh, leaving me in a cloud of diesel fumes and an unnerving silence. The silence was the first thing I noticed. It wasn't just quiet. It was a living thing, a pressure against my eardrums. In the city, there was always a hum, a baseline of traffic and life that you stopped hearing until it was gone. Here, the silence was absolute, broken only by the rustle of leaves and the lonely cry of a distant bird. Old Mill Road was a gravel lane that disappeared into a tunnel of overhanging trees. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows that danced like specters. 2 miles. I shifted the strap of my duffel bag on my shoulder and started walking. Each crunch of my worn sneakers on the gravel felt like a drumbeat marking my approach. I was walking toward the sum total of my inheritance, a piece of land and a mountain of debt. Ms. Albright had been clear. The property taxes hadn't been paid in over a decade. A development firm, West Pine Holdings, had placed a lien on the land. They had already sent formal offers, insultingly low, to the county. I had 90 days. 90 days to either come up with nearly $10,000 or sign the property over to them for a fraction of its worth. It was a cruel joke. Giving a homeless kid a house he couldn't afford was like giving a starving man a locked pantry. The walk felt longer than 2 miles. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of damp soil and decaying leaves. I passed no other houses, no other signs of life, just trees, fields, and the endless, unspooling ribbon of the gravel road. Then I saw it. Set back from the road, almost swallowed by overgrown lilac bushes and a pair of looming oak trees, was the house. It was a classic American farmhouse, 2 stories with a wide, sagging porch. But it was a ruin. The white paint was almost entirely gone, having peeled away in long strips to reveal the weathered, silver-gray wood beneath. Several windows were boarded up, and the ones that weren't were dark and vacant, like empty eye sockets. A shutter hung from a single hinge, knocking gently against the siding in the breeze. It looked less like a house and more like a gravestone for a life long since past. My heart sank. This wasn't a refuge. It was a wreck. I pushed through a rusted iron gate that groaned in protest and walked up the overgrown path. Weeds grew between the cracks of the stone walkway. The steps to the porch creaked ominously under my weight. I stood before the front door, its dark green paint cracked and blistered. The keyhole was framed by a tarnished brass plate. With a trembling hand, I pulled the iron key from my pocket. It felt ancient and important, a key from a fairy tale. I slid it into the lock. It resisted at first, gritty with rust and time. I put my shoulder into it, turning with all my might. There was a loud, painful-sounding clunk from deep within the door, and then it gave. The door swung inward on complaining hinges, opening into a darkness that smelled of dust, mice, and forgotten things. I stepped across the threshold, from the fading light of the day into the heavy gloom of the past. The air was thick and still, the kind of stillness that comes from years of undisturbed silence. My first breath inside tasted of decay. The silence inside the house was different from the silence outside. It was heavier, weighted down by the dust that coated every surface in a soft, gray shroud. A weak beam of late-afternoon sun cut through a grimy window in the living room, illuminating a swirling galaxy of dust motes. It was the only movement in the entire place. I dropped my duffel bag by the door, the thud echoing unnaturally in the stillness. I was standing in a small entryway. To my left was a staircase leading up into darkness. To my right, An archway opened into a living room. Straight ahead, a short hallway led toward the back of the house. I started with the living room. The floorboards groaned under my feet, each step a complaint against the intrusion. The room was mostly empty, stripped of its life. A large, faded rectangle on the wall showed where a painting or mirror had once hung. A single, dilapidated armchair sat in the corner, its floral upholstery faded and torn, spilling yellowed stuffing from a gash in its arm. The only other piece of furniture was a small wooden side table, upon which sat an old rotary phone, its cord chewed through by some long-ago rodent. I ran my hand along the dusty mantelpiece above a bricked-up fireplace. Nothing. No forgotten letters, no hidden trinkets, just layers of abandonment. I moved through the rest of the ground floor with a growing sense of dread. The dining room was bare, except for a thick carpet of dead leaves that had blown in from a broken window pane. The kitchen was a time capsule of mid-century neglect. The linoleum floor was cracked and peeling, the color of mustard yellow and sadness. The countertops were a sickly green laminate, and the metal-edged cabinets hung slightly askew. In the center of the kitchen, its presence as solid and unavoidable as a tombstone, was the cellar door. It was made of thick, dark wood planks, held together with black iron straps. A heavy-duty sliding bolt, rusted solid, was latched shut. Below it was a large iron ring handle, set flush with the wood. It wasn't just a door, it was a barricade. It looked like it was designed to keep something in, not just to close off a space. I felt a strange, cold prickle on the back of my neck as I looked at it. I gave the ring a tentative pull. It didn't budge. I put my foot against the frame and pulled with both hands. The ring was immovable, cold and dead in my grasp. The bolt was just as stubborn, a solid bar of rust fused to its housing. Whatever was down there was meant to stay down there. Shaking off the uneasy feeling, I continued my exploration. I knew I needed to find a place to sleep, a source of water, and check the electricity. The circuit breaker box, which I found in a small utility closet off the kitchen, was ancient, full of thick ceramic fuses. With a sense of trepidation, I flipped the main breaker. To my astonishment, a single bare bulb in the kitchen ceiling flickered to life, casting a weak, jaundiced glow over the room. It wasn't much, but it was something. One victory in a sea of decay. The water was a different story. I turned the spigot on the kitchen sink and was met with a violent shuddering from the pipes, followed by a gout of rust-colored water that smelled like metal and mud. I let it run for 10 minutes, but it only cleared to a murky, unappetizing brown. Not drinkable. I made a mental note to check for an outdoor well or pump in the morning. For now, the 2 water bottles in my bag would have to do. Night fell quickly, a thick, starless blanket of darkness that seemed to press in on the old house. The single bulb in the kitchen felt like a tiny, defiant spark against an overwhelming void. I chose the living room to sleep in, dragging the musty armchair to the center of the room and using my duffel bag as a footrest. It was deeply uncomfortable, but the thought of venturing upstairs into the unlit, unknown bedrooms was worse. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the old house settling was magnified by the silence. The wind moaned around the eaves, sounding like a mournful whisper. I thought about Ms. Albright's words, the 90-day deadline. I thought about the development company, West Pine Holdings, a faceless entity that wanted to bulldoze this piece of my history and pave it over. In the sterile environment of her office, it had been an abstract problem. Sitting here, in the dark, in the house my grandfather had lived and died in, it felt deeply, terrifyingly personal. I finally drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep. And I dreamed. I dreamed of a heavy wooden door and a voice on the other side calling my name. It wasn't a frightening voice. It was sad, and it sounded like my grandfather's, or what I imagined his would sound like. I woke with a start, my heart hammering in my chest. The room was pitch black. The bulb in the kitchen had burned out. I was completely, utterly alone in the dark. It was in that moment, in the suffocating blackness, that I heard it. A sound from the kitchen, a low, groaning creak of wood and metal. I held my breath, straining my ears. It was the sound of a heavy bolt, a sound I had tried and failed to make myself. It slid open with a deep, grating scrape. Then, a long, drawn-out groan of old wood moving against its frame. The cellar door had opened on its own. For a long time I didn't move. I sat frozen in the lumpy armchair, every muscle in my body screaming at me to run. My mind raced, trying to find a rational explanation. The house settling, a change in temperature or humidity causing the old wood to shift. An animal. But the sound had been so deliberate, so distinct. The scrape of the bolt was not a random noise. It was the sound of an action. My logical brain was at war with the primal fear coiling in my stomach. I waited for another sound. Footsteps, a voice, anything. But there was only the oppressive silence, now charged with a new and terrifying energy. The open cellar was a gaping maw in the kitchen, a black hole in the fabric of the house. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to move. My limbs were stiff and clumsy. I fumbled in my duffel bag for the small, cheap flashlight I'd packed. My fingers were numb, and it took me 3 tries to click it on. The beam was weak, but it cut a reassuring cone of light through the darkness. I stood up, the old chair groaning in protest, and slowly, cautiously, made my way toward the kitchen. I moved one shuffling step at a time, my flashlight beam dancing nervously ahead of me, painting jittery circles on the floorboards. I reached the kitchen doorway and peered in. The single bulb was indeed dead. The room was a landscape of shadows, and the cellar door was open. It was swung back on its hinges, revealing a rectangle of profound blackness leading down into the earth. The heavy iron bolt was slid all the way back, resting in the unlocked position. I crept closer, my sneakers silent on the cracked linoleum. I shone the light down into the opening. A set of steep stone steps descended into the darkness, slick with dampness. The air that rose from the opening was cold and smelled of wet soil, stone, and something else. Something faintly metallic, like old coins. My fear was still there, a cold knot in my chest, but something else was rising alongside it. Curiosity. And a sliver of something that felt like destiny, the dream, the voice, the door opening. It couldn't all be a coincidence. My grandfather's letter, still unread in the box of his effects I'd brought with me, suddenly felt 10 times heavier. I had to know. Taking a deep breath that did little to steady my nerves, I pointed the flashlight beam down the stairs and began my descent. The stone steps were uneven and treacherous. The walls of the stairwell were rough-hewn stone, weeping with moisture that glistened in the light. Each step down felt like a step into another world, a world sealed away for years. The air grew colder, and the silence deepened until the only sound was my own breathing and the soft scuff of my shoes on the stone. At the bottom, I found myself in a small rectangular cellar. The floor was packed earth, and the walls were the same damp stone as the stairs, fitted together without mortar. It was empty. No old jars of preserves, no forgotten furniture, no wine racks. Just a small, barren chamber under the house. I swept the flashlight beam across the floor, and my heart leaped. In the very center of the earthen floor, almost perfectly aligned with the opening above, was a single, large, flat flagstone that didn't match the rest of the ground. It was smoother, lighter in color, and around its edges I could see a clear, deliberate outline. It was a cover. This was what the door was protecting. This was what had called to me. I knelt down, the damp earth soaking through the knee of my jeans. I ran my fingers along the edge of the stone. There was no handle, no obvious way to lift it. I pushed at one corner. It was immensely heavy. I tried to find purchase with my fingertips, digging them into the dirt around the seam, but I couldn't get enough leverage. It was going to take a tool, a crowbar or a shovel. I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was on the verge of a discovery. This was not just a cellar, it was a vault, and my grandfather had left me the key, not the iron key to the front door, but the house itself. The puzzle was beginning to take shape. I climbed back up the stone steps, my mind buzzing. The fear was gone, replaced by a feverish sense of purpose. Back in the relative warmth of the kitchen, I slid the cellar door shut. It moved easily now. The bolt slid home with a smooth click. It was as if, by opening for me once, it had decided I was allowed to pass. The immediate mystery of the supernatural opening was replaced by the much more tangible mystery of what lay beneath that stone. I decided the letter could wait no longer. I retrieved the box Ms. Albright had given me. It was a simple cardboard banker's box, heavy with the detritus of a life. I sat on the floor of the living room and opened it. Inside, nestled amongst old tax documents, a faded photo album, and a handful of dog-eared paperback novels, was a thick, cream-colored envelope. My name, Leo, was written on the front in a shaky but elegant script, my grandfather's handwriting. I broke the seal. The letter inside was several pages long, the paper soft and thin with age. I held my flashlight over the first page and began to read. "My dear Leo," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and the house is yours. I am sorry. Those are the first words I need to say to you. I am sorry for not being there. I am sorry for the life you've had. I need you to know that it was not because I didn't love you." The words blurred for a moment, and I had to stop and wipe my eyes. I had spent my entire life building a narrative of abandonment. I had convinced myself that I was unwanted, a burden he couldn't or wouldn't take on. To read those words, so simple and so direct, was like a key turning in a lock I didn't even know was in my heart. He went on to explain. After my parents' accident, he was all I had. He was already old, living on a meager pension and struggling to keep the farm. But the real reason he had to let me go was not poverty. It was a man named Silas Blackwood. Blackwood was a local power broker, a man who had his hands in everything in the county. He had started a development company, West Pine Holdings, and he wanted my grandfather's land. It was a key parcel that connected to a larger tract he was trying to acquire for a luxury golf community. My grandfather refused to sell. The farm had been in our family for generations. Blackwood started with lowball offers, then turned to threats. He was a dangerous, ruthless man with deep connections. He made it clear that if my grandfather didn't sell, things would get ugly. He threatened to make his life a living hell, and then he threatened the one thing my grandfather couldn't bear to lose: me. He told me he'd make sure you ended up lost in the system, or worse, he wrote. He said he'd have you taken, and I'd never see you again. I believed him. He was that kind of evil. So I made the hardest choice of my life. I gave you up to the state, hoping they could protect you in a way I no longer could. I made myself disappear from your life so Blackwood would think he'd broken me, that I had nothing left to fight for. But I never stopped fighting for you, Leo. Not for a single day. The letter was a revelation. It was a bomb that detonated in the center of my carefully constructed world, shattering the foundations of my own story. The anger and resentment I had carried for so long, a heavy cloak I wore to protect myself, began to unravel. He hadn't abandoned me. He had sacrificed his relationship with me to keep me safe. The narrative of my life had been wrong all along. I wasn't an unwanted child. I was a protected one. The weight of that realization was immense. I cried then, sitting on the dusty floor of the empty living room. I cried for the lonely boy I had been, for the grandfather I had never known, and for the years that had been stolen from us by a man named Silas Blackwood. I cried until my chest ached and my eyes were raw. After the tears subsided, a new feeling began to surface, hardening in my gut like cooling steel. Anger. A pure, cold rage directed at West Pine Holdings and the man who had built it on threats and intimidation. My problem was no longer abstract. It had a name and a face. I finished reading the letter. The final paragraphs were what mattered now. I knew I could never beat Blackwood in a fair fight, my grandfather wrote. So I fought him in the shadows. I spent the last 15 years of my life gathering string, collecting evidence of his crimes. The man was sloppy, arrogant. He left a trail. But I also knew that as long as he was alive, any evidence I had was a death sentence for me and a danger to you. I couldn't risk him finding it, or finding you. So I hid it all. I saved every penny I ever made, living like a pauper, and I hid that too. A nest egg for you, a fighting chance. Everything you need is in the foundation of this house, Leo. The foundation of your future. The cellar door will open for you when you are ready. It has always known our blood. The letter didn't give explicit instructions, just that one cryptic clue. The foundation of the house, the flagstone in the cellar. It all clicked into place. The supernatural event of the door opening now felt different, less like a haunting and more like a welcome. A mechanism of love and legacy set in motion by a man who had looked out for me even from beyond the grave. My immediate task was clear. I had to get into that cellar and lift that stone. Sleep was impossible now. My mind was a live wire. I spent the rest of the night pacing the downstairs rooms, the beam of my flashlight cutting paths through the darkness. The house felt different. It was no longer just a derelict building. It was a fortress. It was my inheritance, a legacy of defiance. The next morning, as the first gray light of dawn filtered through the dirty windows, I began my search for a tool. The outbuildings were in even worse shape than the house. A large barn stood listing to one side, its roof partially caved in. A smaller shed, its door hanging off one hinge, was filled with rusted gardening equipment and junk. After 10 minutes of digging through piles of debris, I found it. A long, heavy-duty crowbar. It was coated in rust, but still solid. As I carried it back to the house, I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. I descended into the cellar again, this time without fear. The cold, damp air felt charged with anticipation. I wedged the tip of the crowbar into the seam between the flagstone and the packed earth. I put my weight on the end of the bar. The dirt crumbled, but the stone didn't move. I repositioned it, getting a better angle, and pushed down again, grunting with the effort. There was a scraping sound and a slight shift, a crack of hope. I worked my way around the stone, levering it up a fraction of an inch at a time, kicking dirt and pebbles into the gap to keep it from settling back down. It was slow, grueling work. My muscles burned, and sweat dripped from my forehead into my eyes, but I didn't stop. I was fueled by 15 years of my grandfather's patience and my own lifetime of unanswered questions. Finally, I got the crowbar far enough underneath to get a real purchase. I put all of my body weight onto the end of the long steel bar, and with a deep, groaning scrape, the stone tilted upwards, rising out of its earthy socket. It fell back against the cellar floor with a heavy thud, revealing the dark, rectangular hole it had been hiding. I shone my flashlight into the cavity. It was a space about 3 feet deep, and nestled at the bottom was a dark green, military-style footlocker. It was old and slightly rusted at the hinges, but it looked solid. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I reached down and grabbed the handles on either side. It was heavy, heavier than I expected. With a final heaving grunt, I pulled it up and out of the hole, dragging it across the dirt floor. There were 2 latches on the front. They weren't locked. My fingers trembled as I flipped them open. They made a loud, satisfying, metallic click. I took a deep breath, and I lifted the lid. The contents were neatly and tightly packed. The first thing I saw was money, bundles of it, old bills, 20s, 50s, and 100s, wrapped in waxed paper and tied with twine. There were dozens of bundles. It was an astonishing amount of cash. I lifted one bundle. It was heavy, dense with the weight of a lifetime of scrimping and saving. This was the nest egg. This was my freedom. Enough to pay the taxes, fix the house, start a life. Enough to disappear and never have to look back. But beneath the money, there was something else. A large oilskin-wrapped package. I carefully lifted it out. It was heavy and flat. I unwrapped the waterproof covering, and inside I found 2 items. The first was a thick, leather-bound ledger. Its pages were filled with my grandfather's same shaky, elegant script. It was a meticulous record of dates, names, and financial transactions. It was a detailed account of Silas Blackwood's criminal enterprise: extortion, bribery, illegal dumping, threats. My grandfather hadn't just been gathering string. He had been weaving a rope to hang the man. The second item was another envelope, this one smaller and sealed with wax. I broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. It was a final note from my grandfather. "Leo," it read, "here it is, your choice. The money is clean. I saved it from odd jobs and my pension over 30 years. It is yours no matter what. You can take it, pay the vultures from West Pine, and sell the farm. You could walk away from this town and never look back. No one would blame you. You deserve a life of peace. Or you can use the ledger. It is my confession as much as his. I was forced to participate in some of his schemes to gather this proof. It will implicate me, but it will destroy him and his company. It will give this town and this land back to the people he's been bleeding dry for decades. You can use the money and run and be free. Or you can use this ledger and fight and be a part of something more than just yourself. I couldn't make that choice for you. Be the man I raised you to be, even from a distance. Your loving grandfather, Thomas." I sat there on the damp earth of the cellar, the footlocker open before me, the weight of 2 futures resting in my hands. One was a simple path, a path of escape. The money represented a clean break, a chance to go anywhere, be anyone. I could buy a small apartment in a city where no one knew my name, get a degree, build a life of quiet anonymity. I could leave the ghosts of Stillwater Creek and the Northwood Transitional Living Facility behind me forever. It was everything I had ever thought I wanted: freedom, security, a life without struggle. The other path was fraught with danger and uncertainty. The ledger was a weapon. It was justice, but it was also a declaration of war. Silas Blackwood was still alive, according to the last date in the ledger, which was only a few months before my grandfather's passing. He was an old man now, but his company, West Pine Holdings, was more powerful than ever. To use the ledger would be to invite their wrath. They would fight back, with lawyers, with money, and, if my grandfather's fears were to be believed, with much dirtier tactics. It would mean staying here, in this decaying house, in this forgotten town, and fighting a battle that wasn't technically mine. My grandfather was gone. His fight was over. Why should I pick it up? The question hung in the cold cellar air. For my entire life, I had been a passenger. I was moved from home to home, school to school, by faceless caseworkers and bureaucratic decisions. I had been acted upon. My life was something that happened to me. I survived by making myself small, by not making waves, by being invisible. Taking the money was the ultimate act of invisibility. It was a continuation of that survival strategy. But as I looked at my grandfather's handwriting in the ledger, at the years of patient, dangerous work he had undertaken, not for himself, but for me, for this land, for this community, I felt a profound sense of shame at the thought of running. He had spent his life fighting from the shadows so that I could one day have the choice to fight in the light. He had made himself powerless so that I could one day be powerful. To take the money and run would be to spit on that sacrifice. It would be to say that his struggle meant nothing, that his belief in me was misplaced. I thought about the house, the sagging porch, the peeling paint. It wasn't just a wreck, it was a legacy. It was the last piece of my family, the last bastion against a force that sought to erase history and replace it with sterile, soulless luxury. This wasn't just about a piece of land anymore. It was about my own identity. Was I Leo, the kid from the system who got lucky and cashed out? Or was I Leo, Thomas's grandson, the protector of this home? The choice was so clear, it was painful. It was the hardest choice I would ever make, and also the easiest. I was done running. I was done being invisible. I carefully packed the ledger back into its oilskin wrapping and placed it, along with a single bundle of cash for immediate expenses, into my duffel bag. The rest of the money I locked back in the footlocker. I pushed the heavy container back into its hole and with considerable effort maneuvered the flagstone back into place, covering it completely. The foundation would keep its secret a little longer. I climbed out of the cellar for the last time that day and slid the door shut. The house didn't feel menacing anymore. It felt like an ally. That afternoon, I made my first trip into the town of Stillwater Creek. It was a 3-mile walk from the farm, a small town that had clearly seen better days. Many of the storefronts on the short main street were boarded up. The ones that remained open looked tired. I saw the signs for West Pine Holdings everywhere. On a half-finished condo development at the edge of town, on a banner for a summer festival that had been sponsored by them. They were a cancer, and the town was sick. I found a small diner with a flickering neon sign. I ordered a coffee and a plate of eggs, the first real meal I'd had in days. It tasted like victory. While I ate, I used the diner's spotty Wi-Fi to look up a phone number. Ms. Albright. I had her office number memorized. I walked to a payphone outside the diner. My cheap burner phone had no service out here, and dialed. She answered on the second ring. "Ms. Albright, it's Leo," I said. There was a pause. "Leo, are you all right? Did you make it to the property?" "I'm here. It's a lot, but I'm okay." I took a breath. "Listen, something has happened. I found something here. Something my grandfather left. It's about West Pine Holdings." I could almost hear her posture straighten over the phone. "What did you find, Leo?" "Evidence. A lot of it. Detailed records of criminal activity going back years. It's all here. I think it's enough to stop them." The line was silent for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was different. It had lost its clinical caseworker tone and was replaced by something sharper, more focused, something that sounded like a lawyer. "Leo, listen to me very carefully. Do not talk to anyone about this. Not a soul. Do you understand? Don't go to the local police. Don't confront anyone from West Pine. Just stay put and keep that evidence safe. I'm going to make some calls. I have a colleague, a pro bono environmental lawyer who specializes in fighting corrupt developers. This is exactly what he lives for. I'll call you back on this number in 1 hour. Don't move." She hung up. I stood by the payphone, the receiver still pressed to my ear, a sense of dizzying momentum taking hold. The first stone had been thrown. The battle had begun. The hour I spent waiting for Ms. Albright's call was the longest of my life. I sat on a bench across from the diner, watching the slow, quiet life of Stillwater Creek drift by. An old man shuffled into the post office. A young mother pushed a stroller down the sidewalk. A pickup truck rattled past, its driver giving me a curious glance. To them, I was a stranger, an outsider. I wondered what they would think if they knew I held the key to their town's future in my duffel bag. Did they even want it to be saved? Or had they given up, resigned to the slow takeover by West Pine? The payphone rang, its shrill cry startling me out of my thoughts. I snatched it up. "Leo?" It was Ms. Albright. "Yes." "Okay. My colleague's name is Ben Carter. He's with the River Valley Justice Initiative. He's very interested. He says allegations against Silas Blackwood and West Pine have been circulating for years, but no one has ever had concrete proof. They've always managed to bury the lawsuits and intimidate witnesses." Her voice was laced with a new energy, a mix of excitement and caution. "He's driving up from the city. He can be there tomorrow morning. He wants to meet you, see the evidence, and discuss a strategy. He said to meet him at the diner at 9 a.m. He'll be wearing a green jacket and carrying a briefcase. Can you do that?" "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "I'll be there." "Good. Leo, be careful. You're holding a stick of dynamite. Don't light the fuse until Ben gets there." We hung up, and I began the long walk back to the farmhouse. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The world felt vibrant, alive with possibility. I wasn't just a survivor anymore. I was a fighter. The house was waiting for me, a dark silhouette against the dying light. It no longer felt like a ruin. It felt like home. The next morning, I was at the diner by 8:30. I nursed a coffee, my leg jiggling with nervous energy. At precisely 9 a.m., a man walked in. He was in his late 40s, with graying hair, a kind but serious face, and he was wearing a green jacket and carrying a worn leather briefcase. He scanned the room, and his eyes met mine. He gave a slight nod and walked over to my booth. "Leo?" he asked, his voice calm and deep. "I'm Ben Carter." I shook his outstretched hand. His grip was firm and reassuring. He slid into the booth opposite me. "Thank you for trusting me," he said, getting straight to the point. Ms. Albright told me the basics. You have a ledger? I nodded, patting the duffel bag beside me. It's right here. Can I see it? I hesitated for only a second, then slid the oilskin-wrapped package across the table. He unwrapped it carefully, his eyes widening slightly as he saw the old leather-bound book. He opened it, and for the next 20 minutes he read, his expression growing more and more grim. He turned the pages slowly, his finger tracing the lines of my grandfather's script. He let out a low whistle. "This is meticulous," he breathed. "This is more than just a smoking gun. This is a signed confession, a map of a criminal conspiracy. Your grandfather, he was a remarkable man." "He was," I said, the words feeling true and solid for the first time. Ben Carter closed the ledger and looked at me, his eyes sharp and analytical. "Okay, Leo, here's what happens now. With this, we can file a Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act lawsuit, a RICO case. We can petition the State Attorney General to open a criminal investigation. We can freeze West Pine's assets and halt all their current development projects, citing illegal acquisition and conspiracy." He leaned forward. "But they will come after you. They will try to discredit you. They will paint you as a disgruntled, delinquent kid trying to extort them. They will try to prove this ledger is a forgery. They will dig into every corner of your life. It's going to be ugly. Are you prepared for that?" I thought of my grandfather, hiding this book for 15 years. I thought of the choice he gave me. "Yes," I said without hesitation, "I am." Ben smiled, a real, genuine smile that transformed his face. "Good, because I think we're going to win." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Ben Carter was true to his word. He filed the lawsuit, and it hit the local news like a thunderclap. The story of the long-lost grandson returning to his family farm and uncovering a decades-long conspiracy was picked up by regional and even a few national news outlets. My anonymity was gone. My face was on the local paper. Reporters started showing up at the end of my gravel road, and I learned to ignore them. West Pine's lawyers, a team of slick, expensive men in sharp suits, responded exactly as Ben had predicted. They called the ledger a fabrication and me an opportunist. But the evidence was too strong. The state AG's office launched their investigation. Subpoenas were issued. The financial records of West Pine Holdings were seized. The dominoes began to fall. While the legal battle raged in courtrooms and offices far away, I focused on the farm. I used some of the money from the footlocker to pay the back taxes in full. The clerk at the county office looking at me with a mixture of shock and awe. The lien was lifted. The farm was truly mine. I started the slow, arduous process of bringing the place back to life. I bought a new pump for the well and finally had clean, running water. I hired a local handyman, a grizzled old man named Earl, to help me repair the roof and replace the broken windows. Earl had known my grandfather. "Thomas was a stubborn old goat," he told me one afternoon as we were tacking down new shingles. "Never trusted that Blackwood fella. Said he had poison in his soul. Looks like the old man was right all along." The community, which had at first been wary of me, began to warm up. People would drop off casseroles or pies on my porch. The owner of the local hardware store gave me a deep discount on supplies. They had lived under West Pine's shadow for so long, and my fight had become their fight. I wasn't an outsider anymore. I was one of them. One evening, about 3 months after I had first called Ms. Albright, Ben Carter drove up to the farmhouse. He got out of his car, a wide grin on his face. "It's over, Leo," he said, handing me a thick envelope. They settled. The state's criminal case was overwhelming. Silas Blackwood and his top executives have been indicted. To avoid a complete corporate collapse, the board has agreed to a massive settlement. They're establishing a community restitution fund, canceling several of their predatory land contracts, and, most importantly, they are pulling out of Stillwater Creek entirely. I opened the envelope. Inside was a check made out to me. It was a settlement for the harassment and damages to my family. The amount was staggering. It was enough to secure my future and the future of the farm for the rest of my life. But it wasn't the money that mattered. It was the feeling of peace that settled over me. The fight was won. My grandfather's sacrifice had been vindicated. That night, I sat on the newly repaired porch of the farmhouse, looking out at the fields bathed in moonlight. The house was quiet, but it was a comfortable, peaceful silence now. It was the silence of home. I had arrived here with nothing but a key and a history of abandonment. I had been given a house, but what my grandfather really gave me was a choice to run from the past or to stand and fight for a future. He taught me that a home isn't just a building you inherit. It's a commitment you make. It's a place you protect, a community you build, a legacy you honor. The cellar door never opened on its own again. It didn't need to. Its secret was out, and its purpose had been fulfilled. It was just a cellar door now, leading to an empty space under the house. The foundation was no longer a hiding place for a secret. It was just a foundation, solid and strong, ready for me to build my life upon it. We all face those choices, don't we? The easy road or the right one. The moments that define who we are. My grandfather's story and my own taught me that the hardest choices often lead to the most meaningful destinations. What has your life taught you about the meaning of home or the importance of a second chance? I truly want to know. Share your story in the comments below, because every story matters. I read all of them. And if you want to be a part of this community, a place for people who have been through real struggles and come out stronger, make sure you subscribe. You're not alone here. Thank you for listening.